Hello and welcome to today's show with me, Nassim Ahmed. I will be your host for this week's conversation with the Middle East Monitor. We are asking, what is Israel's greatest export? Is it diamonds, electronics, chips, medical devices, or is it the technology of suppression, control, and domination? I'm delighted to be joined by Antony Loewenstein, an acclaimed investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker based in Sydney. Hello, Antony. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I really need to introduce you. Many people would have read your book, especially those who are on who read Middle East Monitor. Your work spans, critical global issues. You've authored several books, including Disaster Capitalism in 2015. I think your first book was My Israel Question in 2006, and most recently, the Palestine Laboratory, which is the book I've asked you to come on the show and discuss with me. But there is some 17 years between your first book in 2006, My Israel Question, and the Palestine Laboratory. So, what made you want to return to Palestine after all these years? Because in between, you have spoken about a number of other topics to do with global oppression and various other subjects like
Mm.
capitalism, disaster capitalism. So, what made you want to come back to Palestine after all these years?
I think in some ways I never left the issue. I mean, that's the short answer. I mean, I've been working as a journalist for over 20 years. When you said that list, it makes me sound like a very old person, but I'm just going to take that on board as it is. I mean, look, I always see my work as writing about, challenging, and questioning power, whatever that may look like. Obviously, Israel, Palestine, that would be Israel, its forms of repression, which we'll get to. I've done a lot of work, as you say, on disaster capitalism, and what I mean by that is people making money from misery, essentially. I did a book about that and a film, and that was not looking at Israel Palestine. That was looking at the wars in Afghanistan. That was looking at people making money from the aid industry, particularly in a place like Haiti. I've done lots of work on the war on drugs, how, in my view, the drug war, which has been going on for over half a century, is immoral and counterproductive and is harming huge amounts of people, mostly in the global south, to satisfy the drug tastes and desires of those in the global north, cocaine and other sort of drugs. And I was living in Palestine between 2016 and 2020, although I've been visiting and reporting from Israel Palestine for 20 years. And that's where the beginnings of the Palestine Laboratory began. And I guess what it really came out of was a frustration that a lot of the global media coverage, I mean, Israel Palestine, as people to this podcast will know, is in the media pretty much every day, even long before October 7th.
Mm.
Not every day, but most days. But most of the coverage is what happened yesterday. Now, I'm not dismissing the importance of day-to-day coverage. It's important to say that there was an attack here, there was a death there. It's not unimportant. But what interests me is more the bigger picture question. And at the time, some listeners will remember there was a lot of coverage about Pegasus, which was the Israeli spyware tool that's bought by many other countries, democracies and dictatorships. Essentially, it allows a government or an intelligence service to control your phone, whether it's an Android or iPhone. You don't know it's being controlled. When I mean controlled, all your information, literally all your information, whether it's your text messages, photos, videos. If you have encrypted apps, it makes no difference. That can be breached. So Signal, WhatsApp, whatever. And there was some good coverage, some good reporting going on in the West about that. But one thing that was largely missing from that coverage was it framed it as there's this rogue Israeli company doing bad things and selling its tools to Hungary, India,
Mm.
Ethiopia. And I'm not dismissing that that's happening. It was happening. But what ignored was the elephant in the room, which was that NSO, the company behind Pegasus, is essentially an arm of the Israeli state. So, yes, it's an Israeli company, it has a board, and it's nominally independent, but actually, in practice, it's basically doing the bidding of, in this case, Netanyahu and his government. It's used as a diplomatic tool to make friends. So, I show in the book that Netanyahu goes around the world in the last 10, 15 years and would visit Modi in India or Orban in Hungary or some other repressive leader in Africa. And within 6 or 12 months, that government was using Pegasus. That wasn't accidental. But that connection was so rarely made in much of the Western coverage, and it infuriated me. And finally, I'm Jewish. Although I'm not religious, I don't really practice my religion, it's more cultural for me. But I'm proud of the history of Jewish criticism and dissent that does exist. Long before 1948, before Israel's birth, and really it's continued after October 7. Many people watching this and listening to this might feel that the majority of mainstream Jewish voices in the UK, the US, support Israel right or wrong, which is probably true. And I have fundamentally opposed that for over 20 years. And I think it's important, although my work, this book is not really about me, it mentions me at the beginning, but it's principally an investigation. I think it's important that people realize that there are growing numbers of Jews who utterly oppose what's going on in Palestine and do not think that Netanyahu and Israel speaks in our name. So it's a
Mhm.
complicated answer, but partly it's
No,
challenging power.
yeah, I mean, to begin where you finished, I think that there is, I mean, polls after polls show that there is a growing divide between Jews in the diaspora, American Jews, and in
Mm,
other Jews in the diaspora with the Israeli government. Israeli government, in many ways, does not represent the views of the progressive Jews in the
mm.
US, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. But to go back to the original question. I mean, you spoke about the fact that you've done work in Haiti, in Afghanistan, and various continents looking at disaster capitalism, and you would have covered, systems of exploitation, systems of domination. Am I right in assuming that in Israel and Palestine, though, we are seeing the most sophisticated example of the power structures which you uncover, which you comment on, which you write about, the power structures that are dominating the Palestinians and exploiting the Palestinian population is probably the most sophisticated, the most entrenched. Am I right in assuming that?
One of the most entrenched, absolutely. And just some details, some people can get a bit of framing of what we're talking about. So Israel is a relatively small country, tiny population, really. But it has the ninth biggest arms dealing in the world. So it sells weapons to an insane amounts of countries. And when I say weapons, I'm not just talking about missiles. I'm talking about spyware. I'm talking about drones, a range of tools. And that sort of thing makes Israel incredibly powerful. Again, this was happening long before October 7. So much of the media sees that October 7 was year zero, that everything before that was somehow less important and less relevant. Now, obviously, there's a history. October 7 was a significant event, and the last 14 months have been, in my view, inarguably the most catastrophic for Palestinians in their history. There's just not even a comparison. Far worse than 1948. There's just not even a comparison. And that is an incredibly traumatic thing to think and to say. I mean, obviously, I'm not Palestinian, but the idea that 1948, an event that was the birth of Israel, but also the Nakba, the establishment of the state of Israel, which was a catastrophe for Palestinians, it killed about 15 to 20,000 Palestinians and displaced about 800,000. Well, since October 7, we are on a different scale, 45, 50, 100,000 Palestinians. We don't even know how many have been killed. The displacement of about 2 million Palestinians. And the idea that 2023 and 24 is the most disastrous, horrific, and profound impact on Israel and Palestine since its birth, essentially 1948, I think speaks volumes about how Israel has gotten away with it. And that's a key theme throughout the book. And people often ask me, how does Israel get away with this? If any other state, and let's face it, other states have committed human rights abuses. Israel's hardly the first one or the only one. Many states have. The US has, the UK has, Rwanda has. I mean, the list goes on and on. Israel's not unique in committing abuses. But the difference is, as a self-described Western state such as Israel has gotten away with it. And when I say gotten away with it, I mean being able to kill, mass slaughter, surveil, monitor, displace huge amounts of Palestinians with no real international backlash. Now, I'm not dismissing the protests that existed at universities in the US, UK, in my country, Australia. But I'm saying politically, who is stopping Israel? The
Mm,
US? Hardly. Biden, Trump will not. Are the Arab countries stopping them? I mean, I say this regularly and it's worth repeating. When I say Arab countries, Arab elites are deeply complicit with what's going on. Not one
definitely.
Arab country since October 7, not one, has cut ties with Israel. Not one. Talking about Egypt, Jordan, Saudi, not one. And they won't. Why? Because two reasons, in my view, and I touch on this in the book. One, I think many Arab elites support what Israel's doing, trying to destroy Hamas. I mean, that's obviously the stated aim of the war. I would say the goal actually is to destroy Gaza, which has been tragically very successful. And secondly, I think many Arab elites have an affinity with Israel. What do I mean by that? When I say Arab elites, I'm not talking about the mass Arab people. If you ask many Arab people in Arab countries for decades, they say we don't support Israel, we don't support our country leaders befriending Israel, normalizing with Israel. Whether that's Jordan, Egypt, that could be even Saudi Arabia, a country where it's very possible, I think, during the forthcoming Trump era, that there will be an attempt at so-called normalization between Saudi and Israel and the US. I'm talking about Arab elites, Arab leaders, the kings
mm,
who
mm,
essentially rule these countries undemocratically. They have deep affinity for Israel because A, they are desperate for Israeli surveillance tech, which they have bought in huge numbers to repress their own people. They are petrified of Arab Spring Mark II. And I think many of them are desperate to be close to Washington, and the road to Washington goes via Israel, especially in the Middle East. So if you list these countries, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, UAE, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They express displeasure with Israel. They express outrage. They are concerned about Palestinian deaths. In my view, it's hot air because they're
mm.
not doing a damn thing about it.
Yeah, I mean,
And
a lot of what you're saying. I mean, others have commented on that as well, saying that one of the things Israel sees as an existential threat is democracy in the Middle East, where Arab regimes are toppled, and if a government came about which represents the genuine sentiments and represent its population, that is when Israel would really face challenges. So what you're saying chimes with what many are saying.
and I'd say, so I was just going to say, and that's absolutely true. But a key factor which often is ignored there is the arms industry plays into that deeply. That in the
Mm-hmm.
last 10 years, many of the Arab elites and countries have bought huge amounts of Israeli spyware and weapons from Israel as a way to monitor their own people, to repress their own people. So I think it goes hand in hand.
I just want to get your observation of Israel's execution of the war genocide over the past year. I mean, you've been following Israel for many, many years, and you're an expert on this. Has anything about the way Israel executed its campaign surprised you? I mean, I asked this because I mean I was listening to Ilan Pappé, the historian, Israeli historian.
Mm.
He was asked the same question, and he said basically that in terms of the violence, no, because the genocide and this level of ethnic cleansing is built into Zionism itself. So no, not really. What surprised him was the complicity of the West and their refusal to condemn and hold Israel to account. That's what surprised him. So, is there anything that surprised you over the past year?
I think one aspect that has really surprised me, although maybe not shocked me, is the absolutely huge amount of Israeli soldiers posting their crimes online. It's so brazen. Now, for listeners who aren't aware of what I'm talking about, although I'm sure many are, there has been, I mean, who knows how many hundreds, thousands of Israeli soldiers in Gaza, in Lebanon, posting on Instagram, TikTok, whatever platform, torturing Palestinians, holding Palestinians illegally, blowing up homes in Gaza. I mean, just a litany of crimes. And you only do that if you feel complete impunity. It's the only reason you do that. The Israeli military claims that they're disturbed by this. I mean, it's so out of control that clearly they either don't care or don't have any power to change it or stop it. That something has I mean, it's so, as I said, can you imagine if Russian troops were doing that in Ukraine? I mean, frankly, if the US, if social media was available in 2003, I don't doubt for a second that you'd have huge amounts of American and British and Australian troops posting their crimes in Iraq. I don't doubt that for a second, or Afghanistan in 2001 for that matter. That level of violence has shocked me, and it's actually taking on quite an interesting trajectory because in the last month, one Israeli soldier in Cyprus and one Israeli soldier in Sri Lanka were being pursued legally by Palestinian human rights organizations for their alleged crimes. They'd posted their crimes in Gaza online. It had been discovered that those individuals were on holiday in Cyprus and a different person in Sri Lanka. And there was an attempt to essentially arrest them and convince Sri Lanka and Cyprus to charge these people for alleged war crimes. Israel got wind of this. Israel told the soldier to leave. They no doubt convinced or strong-armed the country to let them go. And these people have come back to Israel.
Mm.
This is going to happen over and over and over again in many, many countries. And at some point,
Netanyahu's not going to Poland.
Netanyahu is not going to Poland because he fears potential arrest.
Mm.
Now, people often say to me, none of this is stopping the violence. And that's true. But what is happening is that the freedom of movement of Israelis, senior soldiers, Netanyahu himself, is shrinking. Now, could this change under Trump? It is conceivable that countries that are willing to potentially arrest Netanyahu are strong-armed by America to not do so, are threatened. It is possible. I mean, it's hard to imagine how this plays out. So if you ask me what has surprised me particularly, I mean, yes, as Ilan Pape rightly says, we've seen the violence before, but never on this scale. I mean, the scale is unprecedented. This is not like 1948. I'm sorry, it's not. It is on a much bigger scale. And I think it goes to the heart of what I've been saying for a long time is there is a Western obsession with Netanyahu. The problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. This is not a defense of him. He's an alleged war criminal. I'm not defending Netanyahu. But the problem is not him. The problem is in society itself. The problem is both the public and the political elite. Netanyahu could fall as prime minister tomorrow. Every likely successor is no different. They express that genocidal views and positions, and it's backed by an Israeli Jewish public. Now, again, there are dissidents, there are critics, there are opponents, but they're very, very small. And what I say, as I have said for a long time, Israeli society itself has been radicalized. You could argue since 1948, but I would say especially this century, where not just dehumanization of Palestinians is normalized, it's accepted, it's supported. I mean, you know that because even since October 7 and the shock that many Israelis felt after that attack, in the last 14 months, you do not see Palestinians. You do not hear them. Their suffering, their cause, their pain, the violence, it doesn't exist. Now, this is not to excuse Israelis who are not watching. Israelis are not blocked from seeing certain websites, they're not blocked from going online. On that way, it's a relatively open society. It's not North Korea, I'm not suggesting it is, but they're choosing either to not look, or they have no problem with it. I mean, you see, again, going back to what I said a minute ago, Israeli commentators, journalists, the general public literally daily saying, we are so proud that we've turned Gaza into a parking lot. It's their words. This genocidal intent you do see in other societies. And frankly, it does need to be compared to places like Rwanda in 1994. Now, the death toll in Rwanda was far higher, probably, in the genocide there. Far, far, far higher. I'm talking about the mindset here. I'm not talking about the death toll, the mindset. When you spend
So,
yeah, no, I was going to say, when you spend decades dehumanizing Palestinians so much, you can't be surprised that when a society erupts and is attacked on October 7, their response is genocidal. And the Western response to that, I think, shows for many people in the global South and the global North that the so-called enlightened West is not coming to save us
mm.
at all. In fact, it's the opposite. That there are good guys and bad guys. The good guys are like us. good guys are Israelis and Americans and British and Australians. They're essentially white. The bad guys are Russia and China and Iran. This is not a defense of Russia or China and Iran. They do horrible things in their own countries and elsewhere. I'm not defending them. But I'm saying that it's pretty clear how much of the Western press responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine compared to how Israel has gone into Gaza, Lebanon, and beyond. It's fundamentally different. And it's deeply based on racism and not seeing Palestinians as equal human beings.
Mm. Just to return to your point about the aspect of the past year that surprised you. I mean, if you remember Abu Ghraib in Iraq, there were only a few pictures that came out from the horrific pictures of the prisoner being tortured
Indeed.
with electricity and the sadistic images from Abu Ghraib. But what we're
Yeah.
seeing from Israel's operation in Gaza, the streams, days, days after days, every day there's something they're posting, which is just horrific, just shocking, and shows the sadistic.
It's essentially it's a thousand Abu Ghraibs. It's like a 10,000 Abu Ghraibs. I mean, you and I both know, and listeners will know that if social media existed in 2003, we know that there would be massive amounts of American soldiers, British soldiers, Australian soldiers posting Abu Ghraib-like material on TikTok or Instagram. None of us doubt that reality. I mean, the
Mm,
dehumanization of Iraqis was clear in Iraq. Anyone who knows that war realizes maybe there was no social media back then, but there didn't really need to be. There would be the same in Vietnam. You didn't think the way the Americans and the Westerners treated many Vietnamese in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s was based on the same ideology. It's no
mm,
different. There is no social media back then, of course, but there was a sense of you don't see Vietnamese as equal. They deserve to die. You don't see Palestinians as equal. You don't see Iraqis, you don't see Afghans as equal. And yet, interestingly enough, in all those wars I just mentioned, the West lost all of them. And I would argue Israel's lost the war in Palestine. Now, people would say, how do you say that? Considering the fact that Gaza doesn't exist anymore. What Israel has never achieved in Gaza or elsewhere is legitimacy. That may be a contradiction to what we've just said, that virtually every Western leader supports Israel uncritically, which is basically true. US, UK, much of Europe. There are some exceptions in Europe, Ireland, Spain. My country, Australia, not 100% support, but general support of Israel. But they don't get the legitimacy. And Israel has wanted this since 1948. They've never got it. Yes, in
mm,
certain sectors they get it. They increasingly get it in the global right, global far right, evangelicals, Donald Trump. I'm not saying they don't get it anywhere, but in the general public, Israel and Israelis know they are not getting legitimacy. And does anyone honestly think that the last 14 months has made that better or worse? Far worse. Everyone is seeing on their phones mass destruction, mass slaughter, and genocide in the name of both Israel and Jews.
mm.
So that legitimacy Israel does not have and will not have.
And I think polls show this. I mean, Netanyahu definitely is losing support amongst Jews across the world, and there is a growing awareness that Zionism, with what Israel's done over the past year, there's no way Israel can recover from this. It has become a pariah state, so we'll see where that goes. But I wanted to now just pick up on some of the points you made in your book, and we touched on
Mm,
already, which is um, the fact that despite what we've seen over the past year, uh, the US, UK, and European countries still provide an ironclad support for Israel. They are arming Israel to carry out the genocide that we've been witnessing. How has Israel made itself the indispensable state? Israel, in your book, you show how it provides arms and
mm.
ammunition and technology to oppressive regimes from Burma to the in Rwanda to various other countries. Why has Israel? Well, how has it made itself such an indispensable state to the UK and the US and others, to such a degree that they still have ironclad support despite the horrors we've seen over the past year?
One of the things I talk about in the book is that the Israeli arms industry, defense sector, is almost the ultimate insurance policy. And what I mean by that is this was existing long before October 7. One of the reasons I wrote the book was that a lot of people know the US involvement and backing of dictatorships and autocracies since World War II. That's history is relatively known from Latin and South America to Africa to the Middle East, of course. Asia, what is less known, much less known, in fact, is Israel has been often doing exactly the same thing, often hand in hand with the US. And I think a lot of people have been shocked by that history. On one level, it's quite hidden. I'm not saying in a conspiratorial sense, but it's not that discussed. And over decades and decades, it started since 1948, but it accelerated after 1967 when Israel obviously took control, particularly the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. They've been selling insane amounts of weapons to about 130, 140 countries in that period. And I think that has given Israel, with many, many nations, an insurance policy that if there is ever, for example, a real global shift in public opinion against Israel, and in some sectors that's happening already, Israel has given so many countries so many weapons that their presumption is that those nations will be thankful and reliant when the time comes to back them at, say, international forums. Now, it doesn't always work as neatly as that, but as I show in the book, often it has. Israel sells weapons to country X and their votes in the UN shift. I mentioned before when Israel often was selling spyware, Pegasus, amongst others, to countries in the last 10, 15 years. The votes of those countries at the UN on key votes did shift. They did. Now, I think it's important to say that since October 7, the two biggest arms providers to Israel is the US, of course, and Germany. Now, if that weapon flow stopped tomorrow, the war would continue, but it would shift. And one thing that I have written about and noticed and reported on, some in the book, but in other ways since, is that the Israeli arms industry, in fact, is thriving because of the last 14 months. Israel is live testing weapons in Gaza as we speak. They are testing killer drones, other forms of weapons. They are already trying to sell those at global arms fairs. I've seen them selling them, trying to sell them. Now, it's obviously unclear yet if they have sold them. But I'm moderately confident that when we get the figures, Israeli arms figures for 2024, which we'll get next year, the figures will probably be the highest ever. We got figures a few months ago for 2023, which was over 13 billion US dollars, the highest by far. The clients were everyone from Middle Eastern countries, Asia, Europe. And what Israel has been showing, I mean, on one hand, people have often said to me, how does October 7 help the Israeli arms industry? Wouldn't it do the opposite? The world saw the Israeli defense sector essentially collapse. You have a handful of Hamas militants breach the fence, breach a wall, come into Israel, spend some of them days within Israeli territory, kill lots of people, kidnap lots of people. Doesn't this show that the Israeli defenses don't work? On the one hand, the answer to that is obviously yes. And I document in the book, Israel spent billions of dollars trying to surround Gaza. And obviously it failed. Like literally everything failed on October 7th from the Israeli perspective. But since then, there is literally no indication that the Israeli arms sector is suffering. In fact, it's the opposite. That those companies that failed miserably on October 7 have very quickly tried to push that down the memory hole and refigure themselves and make themselves essential in the Israeli war machine. So yes, we're talking about AAI and Elbit and other prominent Israeli companies, other ones that are less known. And they are selling their equipment to huge amounts of countries because countries are seeing what Israel is doing. Now, a lot of us who follow this are often saying, look at what a country does, not what it says. So yes, some countries are saying publicly, we are outraged with what Israel's doing in Gaza, particularly, or Lebanon, elsewhere, Syria now. We are disgusted. We oppose what's going on. My comment to that is always, are they still buying Israeli weapons, and will they? Are they saying that for a domestic audience to try to appease angry people who don't want to see their country support Israeli genocide? And history would suggest that many of these nations will continue to buy Israeli weapons. Some of the tools that Israel is testing in Gaza, including a much more sophisticated form of artificial intelligence killing, many other nations, my understanding, are a good chance they will be buying that kind of equipment because they want to do that to their own minorities, to their own countries, to their own unwanted people. And the only way that can stop is arms embargoes. The only way that stop is a global movement to try to challenge and stop that industry. The Israeli arms industry doesn't explain everything that Israel is doing. I'm not suggesting that Israel's in Gaza just to test weapons. Of course, that's not true. They're there for their own, for revenge, for ideological reasons, a range of reasons. But the arms industry is central. The Israeli economy is struggling. It's suffering. The defense sector is soaring. And a huge proportion of the Israeli economy is based on weapons. And weapons instead means drones and spyware, etc. And Israel's pretty keen to maintain that industry for years. And thus far, even after genocide, there is no indication. There's a few, sorry, that's not quite true. There's a few indications here and there of certain companies paying a slight price for supporting Israel. But I'm telling you, it is very, very marginal so far because there needs to be what needs to happen is a shift from public outrage into political action. And that does mean pushing for arms embargoes and sanctions. That is the only way this will stop
Mm.
in
One
time.
last one last question before I let you go, Anthony.
Yes.
I mean, we've spoken about Israel's status as a indispensable force within the global arms industry. Do you see a chink in the armor though? One of the chapters in your book is on social media. Social media has been aiding in purveying the Israeli narrative and defending that. But also, social media is a subversive tool, and it can be
Yes.
used against the established narrative. And we are seeing that, many of the people who are now globally supportive of Palestine is because of the alternative media sources. So, do you see a chink in the armor? Do you see a way where now Israel's domination and place within the system of domination can be undermined? And is there a chink in the armor? I mean, I want to end on a point of hope, if there is hope, before I let you
Yes.
go.
I mean, the short answer is I do. And the move since October 7 in the US to ban TikTok, which I think is insane. Not that I'm a big supporter of TikTok, I have problems with TikTok. But the reason a lot of Americans, conservatives want to ban TikTok, it's been made very clear. They are concerned, they say it themselves. They're concerned that many young Americans are seeing what's happening in Palestine and getting angry. So therefore, rather than dealing with what is happening, we'll just ban the platform, which is absurd. So look, I do say in the book that Israel has spent a long time, the last 10 or so years, putting huge amounts of pressure on the Metas, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the others, to either censor pro-Palestine content or shadow ban them. And to some extent, many of those companies have been very open to that. They don't often need pressure. They're sympathetic anyway. They have either sympathetic staff members or sympathetic bosses towards Israel. And we've seen that on steroids since October 7. However, I don't think it's actually working. That you can censor people and ban some people. I'm not minimizing any of that. I think it's outrageous and we need to challenge it. But the fact is that people are still seeing what's going on. They are still seeing on their phones every day the reality, either principally from Palestinians themselves, because there are no international journalists in Gaza. They've been banned by Israel since October 7th. And therefore, we are seeing Palestinians themselves talking about their reality, not just in Gaza, obviously the West Bank as well. And I think that is a profound challenge for Israel, a profound challenge to how do you actually challenge a narrative which is not simply blindly pro-Israel, which is why they are investing huge amounts of resources in trying to often bully those tech companies. And again, those tech companies often are sympathetic anyway, before we even get to the need to bully them. But I think there is a profound change going on that public opinion in many Western countries, based on public opinion polls, not my opinion, is showing greater and greater support for Palestine. That was happening before October 7th, and it's continued. In the general population, in the Jewish population, particularly young Jews. And that scares Israel
Mm.
because how do you control that narrative? with difficulty. You can bully people and censor people and shadow ban them and call them an anti-Semite and whatever else is in the toolbox. But the facts and the images and the videos speak for themselves. And I think what Israel is finding is that their support increasingly globally is in the right, the far right, and the quasi-fascist and the evangelicals. That's where Israel's support is. Israel is becoming a quasi-theocratic state, proudly and openly. And therefore, those who support that vision are increasingly those on the right and the far right and evangelicals. And therefore, Israel's claim that it's a democracy in the Middle East has always been nonsense. No one's ever believed that unless they're blind and delusional. But now, how do you convince anyone of that unless you are blind, ideologically blind? So I do take some hope from the fact that public opinion is shifting. But again, the challenge is translating that into political action, into putting pressure on in our own countries to say to our politicians, you should not buy weapons, impose arms embargoes, do not allow Israeli soldiers on holiday coming to your country and having a lovely time sunning themselves in Australia. It's summer here now, or Sri Lanka, or Cyprus. Do not do that. And now we have evidence of countless Israeli soldiers literally filming themselves in Gaza committing war crimes. Arrest those people, charge those people. And when that starts happening, and I don't know where it's going to happen or when, at some point there will be an Israeli soldier somewhere, or general, or politician, who will be arrested and charged. I don't know where, I don't know when. That changes everything, because when impunity changes, Israeli actions will start to change. They'll be scared and outraged and accuse everyone of being anti-Semitic. It's all be nonsense. But that's what needs to happen. And in some time it will, but that requires us to put pressure on our governments to make it happen.
I think we are closer to that than we've ever been before. So, I am optimistic of that. Thank you, Anthony. It's been a real pleasure hosting you. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
tuning in. I mean, do read Anthony's book, The Palestine Laboratory. It's also available on Audible. I actually listened to it rather than read the book. So, fantastic book. Have a read. And thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Anthony. See you all for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye bye.